B. Immediate vicinity of the open coast. 1. All agree that these shores include only the lands along the sea or the ocean and do not extend back from one or the other. Bayou Castiglione, under the law, cannot be considered a part of the shore. For the shore is that a space of land that borders of the sea, which is at times covered by the rising and at other times is left dry by the falling tide. Burns v. Crescent Gun in a Rod Club. A. Whether we take the criterion established by our code or that by Justinian and apply to either the evidence in the case, we must conclude that the Bayou Cook is not an arm of the Gulf of Mexico, and that its banks form no part of the seashore. The salt water ascertained to be in the Bayou Cook is not supplied by water flood from the Gulf, nor do the waters of the sea, or the Gulf, spread in the highest water during the winter season over its banks. Bayou Cook appears to form a connecting link between Bay Bastion, an arm of the Gulf of Mexico, and Bay Adam. The latter is situated a mile or more from Bay Bastion, in the interior in what is a close proximity to the Mississippi River, a few miles above the point of its confluence with the Gulf. Bayou Cook is about 1 mile in length, 2 acres in width, and 20 feet in depth in the main channel. Some water passes into it from the Mississippi River through small bayous and an adjacent swamp, and some salt water comes into by the way of the Basin Bastion from the Gulf. This co-mixture of fresh and salt water is decidedly brackish. Morgan v. Negodich. 1. If the salt water ascertained to be in the bayou, lake, cove, or inlet adjacent to or connected with an arm of the Gulf of Mexico, does not result from an overflow that is occasioned by high tides flooding in its banks, but, in the first instance, enters an arm of the Gulf and then passes into said bayou, lake, etc., and is combined with fresh water derived from other sources. Same cannot be considered as an arm of the sea, nor its banks the seashore. The waters of the Gulf of Mexico, or the bays or coves behind plaintiff's land, do not spread upon it during ordinary high tides or in the high water seasons. The tide waters back up into the coves beyond the land and cause the bayous in the land to rise up and spread over most of the area. These expressions in the code, the sea and its shores, and seashore, have reference to the Gulf Coast and to the lakes, bays, and sounds along the coast. The nearest body of water that could reasonably be characterized as a part of the sea, or having a seashore in this case, is a small bay nearly a mile away from the plaintiff's land. 2. All the tract of land over which the greatest water flood extends itself in the seashore is the seashore. High seas mean that the portion of the sea which washes the open coast and do not include the combined salt of fresh waters, which at high tide flood the banks of an adjacent bay, bayou, or lake, citing Waring et al. V. Clark. A. The land should not be classed as seashore or public property. The fact is that subject to tidal overflow does not characterize the land as seashore under the provisions of the code. The statutes providing for disposing of such lands, either by the state or the federal government, describe them as being subject to a tidal overflow. It has never heretofore been supposed that the definition of Article 451 of the Civil Code was intended to include in the term that space of land over which waters of the sea spread in the highest water during the winter season, any and all land that is subject to tidal overflow, however remote from the seashore as it's generally understood. Burris v. Salovich, 1923. C. Tidelands. 1. Phillips Petroleum Company v. Mississippi 108 states, upon entering the Union, were given ownership over all lands beneath waters subject to the tide's influence, that the lands became property of the state. Upon its admission to the Union, these tidelands were acquired subject to the public trust doctrine under the equal footing doctrine. However, it has been long established that the individual states have the authority to define the limits of the lands held in public trust and to recognize private rights in such as they see fit. A. The legislature hereby finds that as to lands not covered by navigable waters, including the sea and its shore, which are subject to being covered by water from the influence of the tide, and which have been alienated under laws existing at the time of such alienation, the Phillips decision neither reinvests the state or a political subdivision thereof with any ownership of such lands, nor does the state or a political subdivision thereof acquire any new ownership of such property. B. Under Louisiana law, tidelands acquired by Louisiana through equal footing doctrine that are not seashore or sea bottoms may be privately owned. Thus, inland non-navigable water bodies and swampland subject to indirect freshwater tidal flow, but not direct coastal ebb and flow, may be privately owned. That's Dardar v. Lafourche Realty Company, Inc. D. Lakes. 1. Water bottoms of both saltwater tidal lakes and freshwater inland navigable lakes are owned by the state to the mean high water mark. Miami Corporation v. State. A. As to lakes, however, the state still holds the land all the way up to the ordinary high water mark. State v. Placid Oil Company. E. Bays. Finding that bay was arm of the sea for purpose of determining title to alluvion deposited therein was sufficiently supported by evidence that the bay was part of the larger bay, the mouth of which opened directly into the Gulf of Mexico. F. Arms of the sea. 1. Louisiana Statutes 38, 2356. The area described in Section 2356, Atchafalaya Bay, is hereby permanently declared to be an arm of the sea, and the laws of accretion and dereliction as defined by Civil Code 499 shall not apply, provided, however, as to the other areas, nothing herein shall be construed to affect the law of accretion and dereliction as defined by Civil Code Article 499. A. Absent specific declaration from the legislature, in other words, pre-1974, it is for the courts of this state to determine what is and what is not an arm of the sea. Davis Oil Company v. the Citrus Land Company, et al., in 1990. 2. Lake Pontchartrain has been classed as an arm of the sea. 3. Some canals entering Lake Pontchartrain have been classified as an arm of the sea. A. The waters of the lake are affected by tides and are in the canal. The tides ebb and flow regularly, although to a lesser degree. The canal may therefore be properly declassified as an arm of the sea and is the lake to which it is attached. F. Alluvion. There is no right to alluvion or dereliction on the shore of the sea or of lakes. 1. Littoral owner in Louisiana loses erosion and cannot gain from alluvion or dereliction. A. The riparian rights of an owner of land bordering upon a lake do not entitle him to become the owner of the bed of the lake by the effecting of it becoming dry. Either in whole or in part, if the state owns the bed of the lake while it is covered with water, that is true with regard to both navigable lakes and non-navigable lakes. State v. Alcoin in 1914. B. The temporary uncovering of parts of the bed of a lake by the recurring annual ebb of the waters to become covered again by the rise and the flow of the appropriate season does not constitute dereliction. Sapp v. Frazier in 1718. Number 2. Littoral and riparian owners have constitutional rights to reclaim eroded shore. Section 3. The legislators shall neither alienate nor authorize the alienation of the bed of a navigable water body, except the purposes of reclamation of the riparian owner to recover land lost through erosion. This section shall not prevent the leasing of state lands or water bottoms for mineral or other purposes, except as provided in this section. The bed of a navigable water body may be reclaimed only for public use. Number 3. Alluvion at the mouth of the navigable river. Now, where a riverbank intersects the seashore as a public thing insusceptible of private ownership must prevail, and the riverbank must yield to the seashore. 1. At some point, the bank of the Shell Island Pass ceased to be a riverbank and became what, at one time, was the shoreline of Little Bay. Not until this point is determined as precisely as scientifically as possible can the ownership of the alluvion be determined. 2. Remand to determine location where right descending bank of river intersected with former shoreline of bay for purpose determining whether alluvion which extended the right bank of the river to be formed along the former shoreline, along the right descending bank of the river, or on both. Dallas Oil Company v. the Citrus Land Company. 4. Oceanfront lands owned and patented by the United States. A. United States, not California, had title to the oceanfront land created through accretion, resulting from the construction of a jetty, to land owned by the United States on coast of California. California v. United States. 1982. B. We have reaffirmed today that the federal law determines the boundary of oceanfront lands owned by patented by the United States. Applying the federal rule that accretions of whatever cause belong to the upland owner, we find the title to the disputed parcel rests with the United States. California, existing real estate lands, commercial v. U.S. C. In Hardin v. Jordan, the issue was whether a riparian owner's title stopped at the water's edge or went to the middle of the lake. Plaintiff claimed that through patent from the federal government in considering the extent of land conveyed to the patent's plaintiff's ancestor in title, the court noted, with regard to grants of the government for lands bordering on tidewater, it has been distinctly settled that they only extend to the high water mark, and the title to the shore and lands underwater in front lands so granted inures to the state within which they are situated. If a state has been organized and established there, such title to the shore and lands underwater is regarded as incidental to the sovereignty of the state. A portion of the royalties belonging thereto and held in trust for the public purposes of navigation and fishery, and cannot be retained or granted out of the individuals by the United States.